I just learned something. In order for the microphone to function properly, you actually have to have it turned on. So, you know, learning things every day. That's my daily learning. What's up, everybody? This is Ryan, and you are watching episode 53, I believe, of my live stream Q&A. And yeah, it's going to be exciting. Let's just get the intro stuff done, and then we'll kind of just jump right in here. So first and foremost, if you would like to support the show and you appreciate what I do here, then please do me a favor and consider following me on your preferred social media networks. So we've got Google, we've got Facebook, we've got Twitter, and we have a Slack channel, which is basically like a developer chat channel if you would like to get help from more than just me, because this is typically mostly the today and tomorrow, an hour today and an hour tomorrow is basically all the time I have to help you directly. But we have a great Slack channel where there's lots of developers of all different skill levels to help you help you get some answers and solve your problems and become a better developer. So consider checking that out. Of course, consider subscribing on YouTube and hitting the like button down below. Oh, my talking is great today. Hit the like button down below if you learned something today. It'd be much appreciated. Now, I just realized I goofed a little bit here. Just give me one moment here. I have no excuses for being unprepared today. I was up quite a while ago, so this is just an... The thing is, so I spent all that time preparing for the lesson which I'll be talking about, which is Dagger 2. But yeah, I totally forgot this here, so let's just do this very important part. There we go, thank you. And cool. So yeah, I would just like, crap. Sorry, if you're wondering what I'm doing right now, I'm trying to give shoutouts to the people who kindly donated money to me. Come on, how do I figure out which people are currently helping me? Stupid Patreon IDE here. I apologize about that. There we go. Active patrons, thank you, finally, here we go. So I would just like to say thank you to the following people. My friend A, Cameron Giuliani, who very kindly has donated a whole $50. And so that's absolutely fantastic. Thank you very much, Cameron. So for those of you who don't know, I have a number of different Patreon rewards, but basically how it works is if you contribute $50, then you actually get an hour of my time if you would like to chat, and I can help you with code, I can help you with this, that, and the other. But that's basically how that works. So that's going to be, so my friend A, Cameron Giuliani, Graham Hertzeg, Hank Martin Ledermeyer, apologies if I mispronounce your name, Pijak Jirapiwang, Shoku Mostofi, Sushil Chanda, and Trevor Halvorsen. And so to all those people, I say thank you very much for supporting me. If you like what I do and would like to see me do it better, then please do consider throwing me a couple bucks on Patreon or PayPal, whichever you prefer. And if you're not able to do that or not able to afford that, that's totally fine, okay. I do this stuff for free for you guys and girls out there. So that's our commercial for today. Let's see what's going on in the chat. So we got a couple people, Marco, Davor, Naline, Richard, Andrew, and Fabio Torres. That's a cool name. What's up, everybody? So today's lesson is based on a question. So I got a question from my friend, Mr. Taha Malas. So Taha asked, can I explain how to inject, maybe here I'll copy this over into the workspace so it's easier to read here. Whoa. I almost knocked my coffee over. That would be a fatal error. So Taha asks, Can you explain how to inject a singleton service with Dagger 2 using HasActivityInjector and component builders? So Taha explained, so I'm paraphrasing it a bit, Taha also went on to explain that he figured out how to work with Dagger 2 before this new HasActivityInjector thing was implemented, and he's trying to figure it out after the fact. And so one of the things about this is that I went through exactly the same process with Dagger 2. So when I first learned it, HasActivityInjector wasn't actually a thing. So it took me quite a while to figure out how to configure it properly, because the thing about Dagger 2 is it's quite difficult to configure, and there's a lot of different ways you can do it. So what you run into when you're trying to learn it is that you look at repository A and it'll do it this way, and it'll seem to magically work. And then you'll look at repository B and it'll do it mostly different. The files will be named different. Generally they all end with either component or module, but they'll have different names. Things will be in different places. And it just creates this situation where as a learner you're like, holy crap, would someone just explain to me how to get a basic Dagger 2 implementation working? So once you go through that without HasActivityInjector, luckily you get to basically kind of relearn it all over again, which is what I had to do and what Taha is dealing with now, which is using the Android HasActivityInjector. Now, before I continue, I just want to preface this by saying something important. For the beginners listening, for the next 20 or 30 minutes that I'm rambling, you're probably going to just be very confused and not have any idea what's going on. Just be aware that is not your fault. Like I say, Dagger 2 is, to date, probably the second or third most annoying but powerful API I've ever learned to use, because, like I always say, dependency injection is very simple. A child could understand what it means. I've explained it to a child before. But Dagger 2 is very complicated. So anyways, just bear with me. Once I'm done talking about the Dagger 2 stuff, hopefully I'll shoot for 20 minutes, but you know me, I ramble like crazy. After that, I will stick around and we'll kind of prioritize beginner questions, because I want the beginners to get something out of this episode, hopefully as well. So with that being said, let's get into talking about Dagger 2. Now, again, a second caveat I have to give here is, like I said before, there's different ways to do this, and the way you set it up changes largely based on your architecture itself. And that's one of the reasons why Dagger is so annoying to learn, is if you build your architecture this way and the person you're trying to learn from builds their architecture a different way, then there will likely be little changes that you have to make. So anyways, I'm going to show you how I did it in this particular application, how I typically go about doing it. But the thing about it is that it actually gets even a little bit more complicated with fragments, which is what I would normally do. Anyways, I'm going to shut up because I'm rambling. Let's get into some code. And if nothing else, my goal today is to explain to you the different parts of the Dagger 2 API so that you can better understand them, and I'll show lots of code along the way. So to begin with, so the very thing here we go. Drink a little more coffee. Let's get the mouth going here. That's not what I wanted to do at all. There we go. Okay, so the first thing we need to know about the new Dagger 2 setup is this HasActivityInjector object. So that's kind of the first question. That was the main thing that Taha was basically asking about. So what the heck is this HasActivityInjector? Because if you worked with Dagger 2 before, you haven't seen it before, and this is the new thing. So what we're going to do, so the code I will be, at least my code I will be demonstrating here will be in Android REST tutorial repository, just up here, and there should be a link in the description box below, I believe, to the repo. If not, scream at me in the comments. And but you can just search it by typing Android REST tutorial, and my here, I'll just type it out really quickly. You can find my GitHub down below. It's /cove find Android REST tutorial. That should help. So the first thing we want to do is to just review really quickly. I'm going to close all of these things, and then I'm going to open up the application class. That's not what I'm looking for. GitHub application. So this particular application basically just parses GitHub's open API for a list of repositories from a given username, and if that username exists and has public repositories, GitHub's API will send the data down. It does this through retrofit and OKHTTP, and then I believe I use RxJava for concurrency or some crap. That's not really important. But one of the specifics in Ta's question was injecting like a singleton into an activity or something like that. So that's really what we're going to demonstrate here. So the first thing you'll have to do when you want to get this new setup going, damn it, that's once again not what I wanted to do. I have so many windows open, it's confusing. So the first thing you're going to want to do is you want your application class to implement HasActivityInjector, and that's going to force you to create this method down below. Let me just make sure you guys can see that. Yep. Make sure my face isn't blocking it. And so we get this overridden method here, which returns this dispatching Android injector object. So what I wanted to do first of all is let's just kind of take the magic away from this class. Now it's pretty hard to understand even with me explaining it to you probably, but that's okay. We'll at least be able to figure out something about it. Also notice that we inject it. So this overridden method returns an object which actually is injected into the activity. So we'll talk about how that happens in a moment. So jumping into, I just opened Spotify accidentally. Jumping into our first external source code sample here. So this is the class. This is the dispatching Android injector class, and if you want to have a look at it, it's in the Dagger, Google Dagger repository for Dagger 2. So you can actually go in and just look at the source code of this stuff, which is pretty sweet. So this class is going to be pretty hideous to most people. I'm just going to focus in on the most important parts that you need to know about this class. So in particular, you can read the, up here, you're going to get a basic description of what this class does. The important things you need to notice is that this Android injector class, which is responsible for sort of taking in activities or fragments and assigning the dependencies to them, that's kind of what it does. This class has a map of these things with this giant annoying name. These provider objects which have a, I believe that's a type parameter or some shit. I always forget those names. But it's a provider of type Android injector of type question mark, so like a wildcard extends T. What all of this means, what this thing is, so it's a map object, which if you're confused about that, it's just key value. It like Android intent is a map, essentially. So it's like a collection object. It's full of our dependency providers. It's full of the things which supply the dependencies that the activity we need will require. So just understand this is a map of the dependencies we need to supply at runtime, essentially. What happens is, at some point, I'll show you later on, we're going to call a method called inject. And this is the method where we'll actually pass in our activity. Now, it's actually going to sort of delegate to another method. And I love the name of this method. It's like, we call inject, and then we call maybe inject? Maybe? I love, this is the kind of name that I love in code because it tells you quite explicitly this thing might fail. Anyways, so let's go look at maybe inject. Now this is some hard to look at code for the beginners here, but understand that what's going on here is what's going to be passed in here is, in a sense, our activity or our fragment. And what's going to happen is we're basically going to, down here, I know this is really hard to read, but we're basically going to create the sort of dependencies we need for the activity that we pass in. And then we're going to inject using this injector that gets created through our factories and blah, blah, blah. Longer story shorter, what's going to happen is this is where we actually inject the dependencies to our activity. So if you're still confused, spend a little time looking at this code. I know it's ugly, but just understand that what dispatching Android Injector here does is it has a map of the dependencies, excuse me, and then it's capable of taking in an activity or a fragment and injecting the dependencies into it. How it does that, it looks pretty complicated, but just understand those things about it. So that leads me to the next thing we need to know about. There's a lot to know about here, as you can see. So once we have added, how am I doing for time? I gotta be pretty quick about this. So once we've added this code to our application, so we make it extend or implement HasActivityInjector, we create our dispatching Android Injector. The next question is, okay, well, this thing gets injected here, so where the hell does this come from? That is going to come from, if I navigate to the package, so in this application, this is all going to be in the DI package for dependency injection. This object instance is going to come from our application module, or application component, sort of by extension through the module, but our application component class, which is what we will look at next. So to briefly review, in a nutshell, a Dagger component is a class that helps you find dependencies. A Dagger module is a class that builds dependencies. So just kind of keep that in the back of your mind here. So, with the help of modules, of course. Here we have our main application component. So the first thing you might be wondering is, where the hell did we get this dispatching dispatching Android Injector object from? I'm like 99% sure it came from this module here, which we don't actually write. This is the Android support injection module, and this is like a framework class here. See, dagger.android.support, Android's support injection module. That's where we get this thing from, in case you're wondering. It's just kind of important to understand all this stuff. So the next thing we have, so the rest of this module here, or sorry, component, is pretty basic. We have our inject call here, which is of course where we're going to inject the application in this little snippet of code here. We're back in the application. And then what we do is we have this sort of builder setup. I'm not really going to talk about this because a lot of this just happens behind the scenes, but just, you know, be aware we need to have this application component and we need to create this sort of builder object. This is pretty much boilerplate here. So what I would like to do next is let's look at the things that our application component needs. And let me just make sure I'm not missing anything in my notes. Yeah, so there's kind of three main modules or places from which we will get our dependencies included in this component. Let me just double check the chat really quickly, and looks like no complaints about sound so far, so that should be doing fine, good. So we have our Android support injection module, which is provided by the Dagger 2 framework. Then we have this application module. So what we'll do, I believe that's where I'm going next, right? Is that correct? That's correct. So again, quick explanation here. There's different ways to set this up. What I'm doing here is I have this thing called application module, and it is the place where I build things which aren't specific to a single activity or a single fragment, a single feature. So these are things that are like application-wide. So for example, a database, a data manager, I believe you mentioned, Taha, a REST retrofit service. So we'll just briefly look, okay, so what do I actually build in here? Okay, so I build my OK HTTP stuff. I provide my retrofit implementation, scheduler provider, that's RxJava stuff, REST adapter, blah, blah, blah. So this is where I would build, like if I had a database or I had a retrofit, blah, blah, blah. That's where we're going to build it. And that's basically the job of this module here. Now, one of the kind of little things to note is that we are depending on sort of like a subcomponent down here. So just be aware that the way you set your subcomponents up is going to potentially change, but this is how I do it in this application. All I really wanted to talk about in this thing is this is where I make the things which are not specific to a particular activity or a particular view or anything like that. And it's also where I build my singletons. So, cool. Let's look at where we go next. So the next thing we have is, so up here we have our little subcomponent. So repository list refers to the activity that we're going to be injecting into. So that's kind of an important thing here if you're wondering what that is. Let's go ahead and look at what that class looks like. And this is sort of going to be some of the newer stuff involved in, did I skip the builders module? I think I skipped the builders module, so we should actually, that's okay, I'll talk about that in a moment. So yeah, so here we have our subcomponents. See, this is the stuff that's going to be really losing a lot of people, but just bear with me, we'll get through it pretty quickly here. So in our subcomponent, what we're going to do is we're basically going to set it up so that our, let's see here, extends Android Injector. So this is how we're kind of going to morph our activity in some sense into a type which is applicable to our crazy map we looked at before, I believe is a way of summarizing this. And so this is going to refer to a particular module. So essentially what happens here is when we need to provide our activity as like a interface to the presenter, this is like super specific stuff. This is where it's going to come from. And then in our component, this is, I'm just trying to struggling to explain how to put this into like intelligible English. Just understand that you're going to need to basically have a subcomponent builder class here. Basically what I'm referring to is the documentation in this particular article here. So this is what you're going to need to learn. And as you can see, there's a whole bunch of really annoying steps, and not all of them are very well explained, but this is essentially what we're going to need to do is we create our subcomponent in our module, and we need to make sure that we're kind of returning these Android Injector factory objects. Super confusing, I know. So to just make things a little bit more confusing, we also have this builders module. So what does this thing do? Essentially what it's going to do is it's going, if hopefully I'm being accurate here, it's going to get a hold of our activity. This is actually going to turn into a generated class, but it's going to get a hold of our activity through our repository list subcomponent here, this thing. And what it's going to do is it's going to add it behind the scenes into that map I showed you earlier. So this map here. And through that, we are going to be able to basically provide it as sort of like a dependency type idea here, along with a list of the dependencies it needs. So we're almost done. I know this is pretty crazy stuff for a lot of people watching this. So what I've attempted to do here with some success is I try to explain, okay, these are the things that you basically need. So you need to include the activity injector in your application. You need like an application component in order to actually inject this dependency, and then you need that application component to depend on the support injection module. And this is also where we end up providing the dependencies that the rest of our architecture needs, like our retrofit crap, this, that, and the other. The builders module, this one I didn't really have a chance to quite dive as deeply into as I wanted, but the thing about this builders module is understand that this is kind of how we reference and get a hook to our activities or our fragments. We'll probably have multiple activities sitting in here. If you're doing fragments, it can change. Fragments are different. And so you would list like all the different activities in your application that you want to be able to bind to. So that's hopefully kind of explaining what the builders module is here. And then as far as the subcomponents and these things, this is a little more going to be specific to your implementation. So if you're using fragments, it's going to look different. For example, in this particular case, because at a certain point I want to be able to provide my list activity as just a view interface so that whatever is talking to it doesn't actually know that it's an activity, you might need to use like the binds annotation as opposed to in the application module you have this provides. So this is for a concrete class, and then binds, where did it go, is going to be for like an abstract class or an interface, etc., etc. So all that stuff's pretty boring and not very interesting. The last thing you need to do, if you can kind of get that sort of setup going, is in the class, the fragment or the activity. I opened the wrong one here. Where's the one that we actually inject into? In the activity that you want to inject into, which in this case is our activity here, before onCreate gets called, super.onCreate, we call Android injection.inject this. This is where I believe we're going to call this method here. Where is it? Then I believe what's going to happen is, so when we call that, it calls inject. And then we pass in the instance, so of course that would be this. So we pass this in. And then all of that obnoxious work we did to configure and wire everything together ends up just happening in here. All behind the scenes with just some absolute like next level abstraction. This is some really crazy, like this code looks ugly, but it's really good in some sense because it's like totally abstract in a sense. But yeah, so eventually the end result is that we end up passing our activities instance in here, like I said, and then through all of this kind of insane code is where we actually bind the dependencies from our map up here. Where is it? Our injector factories map. That's where we get the dependencies from. And then finally, we actually inject them here. Okay. So that was a lengthy and detailed pseudo explanation of how to set up Dagger 2 using the HasActivityInjector. Now there's a couple things I didn't kind of mention. One of the things particularly is that notice that, so this is the so this is the actual Dagger and Android guide here. Come on, switch. There we go. And the you're going to want to, whoa, I didn't. There we go. You're going to want to check out this link here if you really want to understand what's going on with arguably not so good explanations. Check this link out here, google.github.io/Dagger/Android. And this is like the official Dagger 2 guide. And this is where I basically got most of the code I showed you. So one of the things I didn't mention is that depending on how you kind of configure your subcomponents, you might not actually need to make, say, for example, your repository, your subcomponent module, sorry, your submodule, your subcomponents module, holy crap, that's confusing, and the subcomponent, you can actually, in some cases, I believe this is the case for this particular code here, I could actually sort of replace some of this code here with this contributes Android Injector annotation. And this will reduce the boilerplate code you have to write by probably about 10%, which is kind of handy. Unfortunately, they don't really explain this in a very detailed way, so I wasn't actually able to figure out immediately where to place this particular code. I believe it just would go in the builder's module, but they don't actually specify that, which, to be honest, is pretty not okay. But you know what? That's all right. So if you want to learn more, check out this guide, and this guide is not, it's going to show you what you need to do, but as I said at the very beginning, the problem with Dagger 2 is that it's complicated to begin with, and then it changes based on the way you architect your application, if you're using fragments, if you're not using fragments, etc. So that's basically all I can give you for now, and with that, we're going to jump into a quick commercial break, and then we'll get to some Q&A. Fun stuff. All right. There we go. Whew. Okay. So, couple things. So a couple follow-ups, and so Anch is asking. This is the first time Anch is watching my live stream, and I believe Anch has an off-topic question. You can certainly ask your question. So to anyone watching, what I would suggest you do, throw your questions out. Yeah, I might not be able to answer all of them, but if you have a beginner question or an off-topic question, ask the question. You don't need to ask permission in order to ask the question. Like I say, I might not answer every question depending on what it is, but and especially to the beginners watching, I just spent like 30 minutes talking about a pretty complicated high-level tool. For the rest of the stream, if you're a beginner watching this, please ask questions. Just really importantly, don't feel bad if your English isn't great. I speak ESL quite well. In fact, over half of my friends are ESL, so I'm not going to make fun of you if your English isn't great, and I'm not going to make fun of you if you're an absolute beginner, because all of those people who make fun of beginners are sort of self-deluded because they forget that they were once a beginner. Like my idol Richard Feynman once said, I was born not knowing and have only had a limited time to rectify that. So ask all the questions you want. Whether you'll get an answer, I cannot say. Anyways. So Marco, as a follow-up, was asking, I don't have kind of any other questions yet, so I'll just follow up on that. So Marco asks, he hasn't worked with Dagger 2. How do I provide something that a module needs to that module? I'll try and parse that question. So again, to kind of review Dagger 2, modules are the things that build the dependencies, that provide the dependencies. And then your components basically are like, in a sense, a map to find the dependencies. So you notice this application component, excuse me, basically has a hook to several modules. So it has a hook to several different places which we can locate our dependencies. Now, the really important thing you need to do with, here's an extra tip to understand Dagger. It's compile time generated code instead of reflection, which is very good. What that means is you can actually look at what it builds for you. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to navigate to the build folder. This is after I've compiled it. And I'm going to go to, which one is it? Is it intermediates? I forget. I think it's generated source. I know that's hard to see. I'll go to the production build flavor. Probably, yep. And then in this DI package, you're going to notice a whole bunch of generated Dagger code. So let's just spend a moment. Let's actually look. So Dagger can seem like magic. You slap an annotation on here and you write a whole bunch of boilerplate. And if you do those two things properly, some magical little woodland creature jumps into the program and just kind of wires everything together. That's totally not what happens. What ends up happening, why Dagger is really cool, is it through these interfaces and abstract classes and all of that crap, it generates code for you. So it's going to, for example, this is the interface that describes application component. This is what I wrote. This is what Dagger generated out of that. So notice it has the same name except it has a Dagger prefix. And it implements this thing I wrote. So in the background, it implements that thing. And then let's actually look at what this thing has. So as you can see, it's got a whole bunch of providers. So these providers are where you actually get the dependencies from. And because this thing is all wired into our application module and our Android support injection module, that's where we get these things from, is from application module. And then our, for example, look at this, I love this generated method here. Get map of class of and provider of factory of. That's the most beautiful method name I've ever seen in my life. This is the friggin' map which dispatching Android Injector uses. I'm pretty sure. I'm 90% sure on that. It can be hard to tell because there's just so much abstraction going on here that it's actually hard to pinpoint exactly what is what. But that, I believe, is the map here. Let me just double check that. I should be able to verify that by looking at the parameters. Yeah, so it's providers. I think that's correct. Anyways, it doesn't particularly matter, but I just wanted to show you people, if you navigate to your build folder, you'll actually find the code that Dagger generates for you. And it's not necessarily going to be easily intelligible, but you'll see this is what Dagger actually writes for you. Anyways, let's see if there are some questions. All right, what do we got here? No problem. Vikas says, thank you for once again talking about Dagger 2. You know it bugs me when I have to, but you're welcome, Vikas and Taha. I would eventually, I will eventually make like a long, dedicated Dagger 2 tutorial. The thing about Dagger 2 is I seriously need like a whole hour to actually explain the whole thing. And everybody complains about long videos. Oh, I don't want Ryan to make long videos because I have the attention span of a squirrel. Anyway, sorry, I'm just kidding. A lot of you do appreciate my long videos, and that's fine. But yeah, just simply put, I will eventually make a Dagger 2 tutorial. However, it will have to be quite long, and I will need a lot of hours to prepare for it, and I don't really have that spare time at the moment. hence why I'm making shorter videos lately. All right. Linksy asks a very delicate question, which I must not give a comment to. But you understand why that might be something which could limit options in the future, that question you're asking. Anyways. Okay, so if some dependency, I'm just reading a comment here, give me a moment. Oh, I kind of understand what you're asking. Okay, I'm only going to answer one more sort of implementation specific question about Dagger 2, and then I'll get to Naline's question, which is a more general question asking why we need dependency injection. But Marco is asking, so if we have a dependency inside our module that needs a dependency, how do we provide that dependency to that module so it can build the dependency we need? I kind of think what is being asked here is, let me just clean up my screen here. Okay, so am I in full screen mode? I am. So, okay, so I believe how this works. So I think what Marco is asking is, let's say we have some part of our application here. Do I have... Well, so one of the first things, in order to provide this retrofit dependency, I needed to... Let's make sure I don't explain this poorly. In short, to hopefully kind of answer your question, because this is the complicated part about Dagger 2, is let's look at application module. I'm just trying to think, do I have a code example of what you're asking me is kind of the problem. Okay. There's kind of two things. So what Marco, I believe, was asking is, let's say we have a some dependency. So for example, a retrofit instance, which requires a dependency from elsewhere. I think that's what Marco's asking. How do we provide that dependency to the module? So if I'm not mistaken, so you can actually kind of just build things in here, which isn't really what you're supposed to do. I believe how it works, let me just try and double check this in the source code. So I'm going to go to Dagger application component. I believe because you can reference subcomponents, I think because you can reference subcomponents, you can access the dependencies of those subcomponents and use them to build dependencies in here. I'm pretty sure. This is I'm just trying to think. So my next question is, what is actually the result? Where does repository list subcomponent show up here? So let's type repository. That's not what I want, actually. Sorry, Control F. So repository. Yeah, so I think I'm pretty sure that because we can supply a subcomponent, that I believe we can then by extension access the dependencies contained within the subcomponent. And I think that's kind of how it works. But to be honest, I've got to just kind of stop answering this question because I don't understand it 100% clearly in my own head. So I'm kind of talking in circles. But at the end of the day, you kind of got to look at the source code and work it out from there. Anyways, unfortunately, Marco, that probably wasn't a very good question, but yeah. Okay. So let's get to Naline's question. So unfortunately, this is still about Dagger 2. But I don't have any other questions, at least not ones that I can answer. So can you do me a favor, Naline or Naline? Can you, if possible, in the comments, can you like spell your name phonetically? Because I just feel bad because I have no idea how to pronounce it. And if you could give me some indication, is it like Naline, Naline? Just because I want to pronounce your name better. But anyways, for now, Naline, I will give it the German pronunciation where you pronounce, in German you pronounce the second vowel. So we would say Naline, Naline. I'm not actually, I'm part German, but I'm not fluent in German. Anyways, I do a very good German accent though. Yes, this is a great question. Okay, so Naline asks, in what situation do we use Dagger 2 or dependency? I'm gonna just add that in, dependency injection for that matter. I asked because I've never encountered a situation where I got stuck. Okay. I'm gonna riff a bit, and I'm gonna explain this in a different way than I would normally explain this, and hopefully it'll be useful. So, normally what I do is I break all of the code in an application down to 3 different types of code, which also maps very well to 3 layer architectures. So what I mean by that is, in any application, you will need to write code that does one of 3 things. Number 1, draws things on the screen / binds data to widgets. So that would be like a view or user interface. You need user interface code. Number 2, you need data of some kind. Even if we're just talking like a Pojo, like a small little, where is it? What's the Pojo here? I think it's a repository. Yeah. Even if we're just talking like a little plain old Java class, although this isn't technically a plain old Java class because it has JSON in it, but, or what is this, JSON? Or is this, yeah, it's JSON. Moshi, that's the library. Even when you just have like a data container class, it still basically falls into the category of like a data class. So you can think of this as the model. I understand what model means, but I actually prefer to use the word data instead of model because it's just less confusing. It took me so long to understand what model actually meant that it kind of pissed me off. You need some kind of data. And then number 3 is you need logic. So we're talking like a presenter, controller, view model kind of, but not really. We need like some kind of logic class. So normally when I'm, say for example, explaining model view presenter to people, I rephrase it as view or UI, data, and logic are the 3 fundamental kinds of code you will be writing. In a sense though, I'm leaving out one extra type of code, which I will, for lack of a better term, I'm kind of just riffing off the top of my head here, but I will call this code build logic, or code that builds and wires your application together. So this is actually also a fundamental type of code that almost any application of any worth will need to include, build logic code. So your question is, why would I use Dagger 2 or dependency injection when I haven't needed it before? So the thing is, let's see. Oh, okay, that's not actually your real name. It's just a username. Oh, it's like some... Oh, okay. I thought you had like a friggin... So earlier, a moment ago, just let me break for a minute. I just asked Naline what his name was, because I thought it was like Hungarian or Ukrainian, and it turns out it's just a username in Skyrim's dragon tongue. So now I don't care about how I pronounce it, but that's good to know. Okay, thank you for clarifying that. Now I will no longer feel bad if I mispronounce it. So, oh my god, was I talking forever in full webcam mode as I was writing? If I was, I apologize. This is all that I wrote. Oh, sorry, I can be such an idiot with that sometimes. So these are the 4 things your application will need to... This is the 4 kinds of code any application needs to write in a nutshell. Now, whether you apply first point, you're already doing dependency injection. Just understand that. Dependency injection, let's leave aside Dagger 2. Dependency injection is this. Once again, I'm in full screen mode. This is dependency injection. It's when you have a class, an object, and the things that it needs, its dependencies, some other thing gives it the dependencies. I hate that name dependency injection because although it does describe what happens, it makes it sound like this complicated, delicate kind of operation. It's literally, this is a form of dependency injection, just using construction. See, I even wrote it here. Constructor arguments. That's dependency injection. So what we're doing is instead of having this, for example, a presenter contain its own build logic, I actually delegate that build logic, the code necessary to build the dependencies, to a different part of the application. If you're working in Dagger 2, that different part of the application is your Dagger 2 implementation. So what I'm going to do next is I'll show you a diagram which should hopefully explain what I'm talking about here a little bit clearer. Now that you understand, dependency injection is not complicated in principle. It's just Dagger 2 is complicated. So I'm going to open up, what was I looking at here? Where's my huge marble machine architecture diagram? So this is basically, in a nutshell, what the Android REST tutorial application looks like, except it doesn't actually have a fragment. And then this DI framework, that's all of the Dagger 2 crap. So in a sense we have, so as I said before, we have 4 different fundamental kinds of code: UI, data, logic, and build logic. Logic up here means like communication and event handling logic, but not build logic, specifically not build logic. These 4 things correlates to having 4 layers. We've got a layer here, we've got a layer here, we've got a layer here, we've got a layer here. Okay? Happy? So why we have a dependency injection framework, why we pull build logic into its own separate area, which doesn't have to be Dagger 2, is because a UI controller, a view, should not know how it gets built. A presenter should have no idea how it gets built. A database should have no idea how it gets built, because those are not things that concern those types of objects. Instead, we create a separate area where all of that stuff gets handled for us. Now, how I will wrap this up is you might be wondering, you might still be wondering, okay, you've kind of explained how this works, but why do I actually want to do it? what are the benefits? Let's just answer this specifically. What are the benefits of applying dependency injection in your application? And remember, dependency injection can be as simple as oops. I won't repeat that. Constructor. Sorry. Almost wrote a bad word there. That's a very bad word in Canada and North America, but it's actually a very common word to use in Australia and South London. Anyways, dependency injection can be as simple as constructor arguments. It's literally giving something the things it needs by way of constructor arguments, like I just showed you here. It's literally not more complicated than that. It can be, but it doesn't have to be. So, what are the benefits though? Number one, if I'm building a class with dependencies and I've applied dependency injection, I have made it so that my class is not responsible for building its own dependencies. What does that mean? When I want to test this class, when I want to make sure that this class works, I can give it fake objects, fake dependencies. Okay? Why is that something you want to do? For example, let's open up calculator presenter test, I believe it's called. I can verify these are fake versions of the dependencies that this class needs using mocks. I can verify if I write my test properly. Just ignore the red for now. I renamed some stuff and haven't fixed the tests yet. Kill me. These used to pass, as you can see. So I can verify the function of my presenter or whatever class I want to test by giving it fake objects and then running tests based on those fake objects. I control what the objects return, and then I figure out, okay, how does this presenter behave with specific inputs that I give to it? So that's kind of the first thing. The next thing that it affords you, and this is quite key, is that if you give your object interfaces like I've done here where appropriate, so this is an interface, this is an interface, it's an abstraction, then I can swap out these abstractions super easily. So let's say, for example, that instead of this use case down here, this class was talking to say a REST adapter or a service or a database, it doesn't matter. If it's talking to an interface, and because something else controls building these dependencies, I could, for example, switch from Firebase database to Realm to Room, whatever I want, and it won't change this class unless the interface changes. I can't really stress how fundamentally important the concept I just explained to you is, because when you're building your application properly and you're separating these layers, the benefit of doing so is that your application is easy to change and easy to test and easy to design from square one. So hopefully that makes sense. Now, if you're still not clear on what I'm talking about, I'm telling you what you need to do is you need to apply the principles I'm talking about, and after a certain point, I'm pretty sure if you do it properly, you will understand the enormous benefits of separating your architecture into reasonable layers, keeping your build logic in its own area, and use a framework if you want. You don't have to use Dagger 2, but I would suggest it. Keep your UI code in its own area, keep your logic kind of code in its own area, and your backend stuff in its own area. Have them all talk to each other generally through interfaces or abstract classes, and you are well on your way to being a good software architect. So that's why you want to apply dependency injection. That was a super long answer, but hopefully I touched on a couple different things here, so hopefully that if you're kind of new to like these sorts of principles, then I probably just like blew your mind. All right. So awesome, good. It looks like I did answer some questions, so that's great. Naline, one little important thing. Before you jump into Dagger 2, I'm going to suggest you look at my Kotlin MVP calculator tutorial, even if you're not a Kotlin person. And what I want you to do is I want you to look at the go to the dependency injection package in this particular repository. It's down in the description box below. And open up the injector class. And so why I want you to look at this first is that in this particular application, I apply this dependency injection. I still pull build logic into its own area, but I hand write it. I don't use Dagger 2. So why I would suggest you do this is if you look at this injector class, this is essentially like a basic handwritten dependency injection implementation. This is, in a sense, what Dagger will generate for you, except obviously this is a tiny little calculator application, so I don't actually need Dagger 2 here. When you get to larger applications, the larger the application, the more likely you will benefit from using a framework, because there gets a point in a large application where writing all of this build logic by hand actually sucks worse than configuring Dagger 2. I know it's hard to believe, but trust me. Anyways, so yeah, I forgot why I was rambling about that, but yeah, just a quick suggestion. Check out that first before you go into Dagger 2. Carlos Perez kind of asked if I was, well, Carlos just said solid principles question mark. I was basically talking about solid principles as I was explaining dependency injection, so you're absolutely right. In my own way, of course. And so I think I got, let's see here. One more question from Aswin. I think I've seen you in previous live streams, so thank you for joining me again, if that is correct. And this is a pretty simple one. Good question, though. So, Aswin asks, is it better to use activities as views or fragments as a view with only a single activity? So, I will answer your question, but right off the bat, what you're asking me is it better to do A or B? And the problem with that question is that it depends. To really answer your question accurately, you have to factor in what you prefer to do as a developer and the unique requirements of your particular application. So, and what I mean by that is, if I were to clearly, how can I phrase this? I can't definitively say which is better. I can only tell you which I prefer to do and why, with the understanding that you're going to find repositories and different developers that will say, my way is best, or I like to do it this way for X, Y, and Z. And then the next developer will say, no, I don't like to do that at all. So for X, Y, and Z reasons. So just understand right off the bat, I can't actually answer your question in a sense, because you're asking me, is it better? It depends on how you do it. It depends on your preferences. However, I'll still try and give you some useful information here. Is it better to use activities as views or fragments as views with only a single activity? I actually do neither of those currently, although I'm probably moving towards using a single activity with multiple fragments. We'll see. I will explain what I like to do. So the first, let me give you just my thoughts on this question. I don't like to, oops, got some leet speech going in there. I don't like to use activities as views at all outside of tiny demo projects. So you will notice in Android, in some of my demo repositories like Android REST Tutorial, which is just a demo app, I do actually use an activity as a view. Absolutely. In most of my repositories, particularly my more recent ones, what I do is I have the, let's see here. A fragment is the view, the whole view hierarchy, and the activity is just a container. So what I'm going to suggest to you, I don't like to use activities as views at all. I like to use them as feature level containers. If you're wondering, so container is a special jargon word. A container is like the context or environment that something exists within, and I use a single activity as the container for a single feature of an app. So what is a feature? Honestly, that's easier to just explain with an application here. Just give me a minute. That's honestly easier to just show you. Actually, let's not open up Gmail. I was going to show you an example in Gmail, then I thought maybe I shouldn't just be displaying my emails over the internet live. Okay, so just to give you an example, this is an older app of mine. Where is my mouse? There we go. So in an older app of mine, Post Trainer, I have one feature that lists alarms. It's basically a glorified alarm clock app. I have a feature, oops, that's not what I wanted to do. I have a feature which allows you to create and edit an alarm. And when the alarm goes off, it takes you to a new feature, which is the alarm receiver. So what I'm saying here is a feature is like a single sort of part of your app, or typically a single screen. So that's what I like to use activities for, is they're basically like feature level containers. And then, oops, and then the application class is like the container for all of your activities, essentially. So whole application, activity, activity, activity kind of thing. I forgot what the question was. Is it better to use views or fragments? Activities or views as fragments? This is why I don't, so in a nutshell, this is why I don't like to use activities as views. To me, they are better, there's more reasons I could give you. They have a more fragile life cycle. There's a lot of reasons. I typically don't suggest you use activities as views, and I think most developers lately would basically agree with that sentiment. As far as having only a single activity, that's in all likelihood the best way to do it. I don't actually do it that way right now. I have one activity, pretty much one fragment, typically speaking, one presenter, one view model for a given feature of my application. You could also have one activity for every feature of your application, and then you just like go one activity, view, presenter, model, one activity, view, presenter, model, another activity, sorry, fragment, sorry, I totally screwed that up. One activity, 3 fragments, 3 presenters, 3 view models, or however you want to do it. There's different ways to do it. This is good too. What I would say to you, I do recommend you use fragments as views. Fragments work great as views, and if you want to understand why, I literally just made a video on fragments on my channel. Go check out my, it's like Android WTF fragments as views. So go check that out and it'll help you understand why fragments are great as views. Anyways, I think I'm going to wrap that question up there because I'm getting tired and rambly. And yeah, it looks like there is no more questions. Oh, one more quick, I'll just answer this question quickly for Taha again. So Taha asks, what does model mean in the context of software architecture, of course? What does model mean? This is something which I had a lot of confusion because so sometimes model seemed to mean a layer of an application. Sometimes model seemed to mean so I would call this a data model, but you might also call this or a POJO/POCO. And what I mean by this is sometimes people would say that a class that looks like, for example, so in Kotlin MVP, blah, 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 tutorial thingy, Kotlin MVP calculator, I have a data model which represents a mathematical expression. So sometimes model seemed to mean something like that. Sometimes model meant like this whole thing down here. So this, and sometimes I would have like models, so to speak, data models up in my front end. So then it became, well, how is a model not just the back end? Is model just a synonym for the back end? What the hell does this friggin' word model mean? So part of the answer here is we just have a situation where we have developer A meaning one thing, developer B interpreting that a different way, and then explaining it to developer C in a different way. Let me explain what the commonality, how I think of the word model now. I don't actually use the word model very much. So just to explain, what does model mean? Something that models data. It can be big or small, but it always has to do with access or storage to structured data. In some small sense, whether I'm talking about let's say, for example, whether I am talking to, let me go to the back end here. Whether I'm talking to GitHub's databases and returning data from a cloud service or a database in my backend, whether I have all of this crap going on, or I just have like a tiny little plain old Java class which basically models the response, or it doesn't even have to model a response, it just models something. This could be note, it could be note, it could be exercise, this could be user, modeling some kind of data. They're all models. They all, at the end of the day, have to do with access and storage to structured data. So when you hear the term model, what I basically want you to think is always assume that it has something to do with this little definition down here. It must deal with storing and accessing structured data, but it doesn't have to be. The reason why I was always confused, I was like, well, model seems to be 3 different things at once. Well, the thing is, yes, but all of those different things all have to do with structured data, access and storage to structured data. So that's basically it. That's what model means. And that's actually why I now use the word data. Whenever I explain model view presenter to people, immediately I always, you'll even notice when I was explaining this question up here, I always do, like, whenever I say model, I'll use the word model because people hear it, and then sometimes I just won't use the word model. I'll actually just say data, because that's in a sense, a model models real world information. That's kind of where this word comes from, as far as I understand it. Easier to say data in my impression, because when I say data, you kind of instantly know that I'm talking about some kind of information that is stored in the computer, which is easier than just thinking about a model. That's basically it for now. Let's see if there's any more questions. No, looks like there are no more questions. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed that, please hit the like button down below. I do apologize to the beginners because a lot of that was just talk about Dagger 2, but thankfully I got to explain why you might want to use something like Dagger 2 in your applications, and we did get to some more beginner level stuff towards the end. That's it for now. Tomorrow at 10 a.m. UTC-7 will be my live coding show, where I'll basically be coding my Catalyst application live and on camera. So if you'd like to join me for that, come hang out tomorrow, same time. That's all for now. Peace out.